I think we will call the meeting to order and get started as best we can. I'm not sure. We do expect 2 more folks or so up here, but maybe 3.
I thought it was going to show.
Okay. As far as we know. Okay. All right. So we haven't met in a couple of weeks, and so we're going to basically pick up where we left off, which is timberland discussion and cultivation in timberlands. And then item number 2 is cannabis nurseries, which Jesse was just saying he was hoping that it could get picked up into the ag land section. And then item number 3 is industrial hemp. So we will attack them in that order and kind of get started. Was there a report to the board in between? Nothing.
Wait. Yeah, I guess the day after our last meeting, I did.
You did?
I did get a report to the board.
Okay. You want to give us a quick update
the
there?
Our last meeting. Yeah, let's see. Look for my notes. I forgot about that. Oh yeah. So we talked a little bit about our discussion about the general plan, and Joel kind of came to some good positive conclusions, I think, with community development about that. I reported to the board about, let's see, I didn't get into much specific numbers here. I just talked about what we talked about: scale of operation, water sources, road access, setbacks from national forest, state parks, and residential zones, and setbacks from neighboring properties of like zoning and neighbors with use permits for residential uses. TPZ lands needing to be rezoned to something taxable. PO zoning, rezoning to something like ag forestry. And they did talk about nurseries. Now we thought they would be suitable in ag lands in the right kinds of greenhouses that mitigated sight and odors. I mentioned how that could be a good job creating export business. And I just mentioned the hemp program and how there's a little bit of movement at the state level with the hemp program. And so it's probably time to work that in a little bit into what we talk about, because there are the hemp program is going to want some space from other cannabis plants. And that's about it for that.
Okay, is there a supervisors meeting tomorrow? Okay. That was
No, it's the 13th.
Oh,
Yeah, they're
no.
skipping it because of the
Skipping
election.
Yeah,
Yep.
there'll also only be one meeting in December. I believe it's December 11th.
Okay.
So there's only 2 more meetings before the end of the year to get this adopted.
Well,
Not this, probably, but
so this next meeting will introduce the retail. No, sorry. The retail and manufacturing will be on for adoption. The cultivation will be on for introduction. And then it can be adopted in that December meeting. The only way that anything we're talking about here would make it to the board before the end of the year is if it got to the December Planning Commission, and then it could be technically adopted at that next board meeting, because we can skip the introduction when we do the Planning Commission. But that means getting this thing drafted and to the ERC tomorrow, I think.
I don't need to do that.
Yeah, I don't think we need to rush it. We did hit that Board of Supervisors goal of we have retail, manufacturing, and cultivation, some sort of functioning ordinances to the board by December. So I think we call that a win and not rush the complex issue of timberland.
What did they think at the board level of rezoning our TPZs in our other zone that we asked, the forest?
I don't remember if I've even.
I didn't get
gotten
any
that far.
input or feedback from the last board meeting. It was attended by only 3 supervisors. And so it was a quiet, short meeting. Nobody spoke. The worthless meeting. No, I wasn't worthless. It was great. I got lots of value out of it myself.
All right, we're more
All right.
complete. We're more complete now.
Well, we
So-
talked about the cultivation in the timberland. Are we going to, or is the county going to have to rezone those before we start going to TPZ and others, and then all of a sudden you rezone it to something else?
And applicants are probably gonna have to do the
Yeah,
rezone.
the applicant will apply for the rezone to AF in, I guess, an interim period.
Is there,
There's a more of like a long-term plan to take that PO and turn it into whatever's appropriate for its underlying land use designation, but it's going to be a process. And Heidi and I and Taylor did talk about a general plan amendment with kind of a lot of different things in it, and we would do some tweaking to lay the groundwork for cannabis. One of those would be to figure out some language that would allow smaller than 20-acre parcels to come into AF. I think that will allow a lot of the non-conforming parcels to.
your ultimate goal is AF to be the one zone that's, you're going to try to get to?
Yeah, Heidi?
Yeah, that's what I understand, that what we're looking at.
Yeah, sounds good.
Is there any language you're considering for allowing these smaller parcels to be rezoned?
I haven't thought specifically about the words we would use, but the basic concept would be if you are already a timberland parcel, you can come into AF. So we're not going to let somebody zone an ag parcel or something. If you're a TPZ or a PO and you are for some reason under that 20 acres. So instead of grandfathering in everybody who's non-conforming at the date, we would say if you're one of these specific types of zones, you can come in to AF specifically, something like that.
And just to double check, was that going to be a policy in the land use chapter of the general plan? Or would that be part of the ordinance?
I think that would go in the general plan.
Okay, thank you.
I think it would need to, yeah.
Okay.
As far as the consistency issues that Jesse brought up, you know, the uses that are listed for timberland are pretty narrow. But at the same time, the consistency chart does list AF as being consistent. So we kind of presume the document considered both of these things and thought they were consistent. And then what you have is a situation where anything that is timberland, any use that's other than, you know, growing and harvesting trees, is kind of conditioned upon not interfering with those timberland uses. So it's not like it's an ag parcel where you can now do any agriculture. You can do agriculture on AF that doesn't conflict with your timberland designation. And that's why I think we looked at it and felt like it was consistent. We might still tweak some of that. We might expand some of those uses if it just says grazing and mineral extraction or whatever it says. Maybe we adjust some of that language to make it more clear what we're thinking is consistent. I think we're probably going to start moving forward and letting permits happen. And because there's a lot of things we want to get in that general plan amendment, it might be a little bit more of a year out or something like that. So I think we're good to move forward, is what I'm saying.
Perfect. That's good news. All right. So that, I think, brings the question back to, we talked about minimum parcel size for timberland, and we were just forced into starting at 20 acres. So we could talk about that again. And then in terms of being consistent with the minimal development and not interfering with timberland use, I wanted to talk a bit about structures, permanent structures, temporary structures, what would be required, what would not be required. It kind of seems like maybe not pushing toward requiring permanent structures where they're not necessary, if that makes sense. Some light greenhouses can be considered temporary, but if all structures had to be considered like permanent structures conforming to California Building Code, you might end up pushing toward more permanent development. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think we would need to involve our building official because
Okay.
there's definitely definitions in the building code as far as what's temporary and what's not, and we'd want to make sure that we're consistent.
Well, we're not talking about odor mitigation, right?
No.
So I think it doesn't really matter, right? If you want to use a structure that needs to be permitted, then you need to get it permitted.
Okay.
If you don't, I think, part of the reason of having you out there is that you don't need the odor mitigation.
Sure.
So I think it's just your particular farming practices, and you otherwise comply with the building code.
I suppose it has to do more with developing the ordinance specifically. For example, in some localities, ag zoning, you have a lot more flexibility with your construction. It's specifically worded that your structures don't have to comply with building code, and you have your own
Not in
rules.
Del Norte County.
Not in Del Norte County. There isn't any of that. So that's why I'm saying if it's appropriate to consider that or talk about it, then we should. If not, if you don't want to get into that, I completely understand, but it'd be good for the farmers.
Yeah.
Are you talking about revisiting it everywhere or just in Timberland, just for cannabis?
I have no idea. I don't know. I'm not expert enough to know how it works.
Yeah, so let me just weigh in since I'm a farmer. And we do business in Humboldt, and you don't need a permit to go build a feed barn or a lot of other ag structures. And that's a real nice convenience, right? I don't really know how well it works down there, but it seems to work, and I think that's what you're getting at. And then up here, you need a permit for everything, no matter what the use is, as far as I know.
Is that also within land that's within the coastal zone?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. The ranch I'm thinking of is in the Elk River flood zone, and it absolutely is in the coastal zone. So yes.
Well, if Humboldt has an LCP that was approved by the Coastal Commission that allows that, great. Heidi, are you thinking that ours, probably we would have to get the Coastal Commission to sign off on a change like that? And we probably wouldn't be successful doing that?
I have no idea. I haven't really investigated that.
Yeah,
at
let's
all.
stay out of the
But yeah,
coastal
I would
area.
say it would require an amendment to our local coastal program because it would be a change. So there are no inspections, you just build? Are there size limits?
Yeah, I can't answer everything other than that we went through a lot of hassle to get permits and get this and get that. We got 3/4 of the way through and realized we didn't need anything,
Oh, wow.
so we just stopped.
And I think partially what Jesse's getting at is the fact that, what we may be considering as a structure in our ordinance, you're talking about $50 or a couple $100 piece of plastic and a couple of posts.
Yeah, and
But
that's,
your building permits are 5 times the cost of this rinky-dink little plastic greenhouse he's trying to put up, and that's where the whole
Well, and I
issue
think-
comes in with the cannabis situation.
Yeah, I mean, technically, like a T-post is a structure if you want
Yeah,
to get down
technically,
to it, you know,
a lot of these
so-
outdoor grows would put in like 4 posts and a $50 piece of plastic, but it's bigger than 100 square foot, so it's falling under your building code, and the permits
Right.
and all of the inspection processes involved in it are 10 times the cost of what you're trying to do.
I mean, it does go, not to talk about coastal, that's, I think, complicating it. I don't know what's allowed in Humboldt in the coastal area. But non-coastal, we're talking about timberland here. So, it's not always a good thing. I have a friend in Humboldt where right across the street, they built an ag building with no permit because it wasn't required. And it's the scariest, sketchiest, ugliest building I've ever seen. It was built with trees augured into the ground, and it's leaning all over which way and all staked together with scrap wood, and it looks like it's going to fall over and kill somebody, but it was, and the neighbor complained about it, saying, "What's this? Is this all right?" And the county's like, "Yeah, there's no requirement for a permit, you know? And so it's kind of, I mean, the building's still there. It didn't fall over, but it's ugly.
Yes.
It's right in the, you know, in a beautiful view zone.
So if we were, what are we considering here? Obviously, we're talking about this because we are considering, maybe recommending that county.
Yeah, I'd just like to lobby for some simplicity when it comes to really light-duty, simple structures, like what Kurt's talking about, you know? When I drive a form stake in the ground and bend a piece of PVC across it and put a piece of plastic over it for 3 hours a day, I don't want to have to get a building permit for that. I will if I have to, but I just want to know if things like that make sense.
Our greenhouses are exempt though, I think, right? Or
No,
wrong?
no.
No, that's another areas.
With the 6-plant thing that they're saying that, you know,
Right.
anything over 100 square foot is all of a sudden supposed to have a building permit, which is falling into
Sure.
what Jesse's talking about.
So I'm not saying no oversight,
Considering.
so you don't get these big dangerous buildings or something with no permits,
Now,
but.
greenhouses were exempt 20 years ago out there in Fort Dick when Sun Valley was building them. So,
Oh, okay.
so. Yeah, well, they built 55 of them without permits. And as long as you didn't have concrete involved in the project was my understanding. So is someone telling me that that's changed?
As long as I've worked here, they've required permits, and I've worked for the
Wow.
county for 23 years, so I'm not sure how those happened.
Interesting, yeah, okay.
All right, well, maybe food for thought for the building department, or, I don't know, maybe it's first to figure out if
Actually,
it's even
that's the
appropriate.
policy decision of the Board of Supervisors.
Oh,
Then it would
okay.
come back to us to revise the ordinance, but that would definitely be the Board of Supervisors making that call. And, I mean, we wouldn't just be looking at it for cannabis. Obviously, we'd have to look at it across the board for all things. And one thing I'd just like to say, on the coastal, a lot of that, I mean, we have a permit review, but a lot of that has to do with protecting coastal resources.
Yeah, in coastal, I
which-
wouldn't think this would apply necessarily. but-
Yeah, okay.
I mean,
Just
I don't know
food
if
for
it can be
thought.
separated or not. Because coastal commission, that sounds like something that would never work. But,
So are we asking the county to consider this, or obviously it's the Board of Supervisors, or are we just chatting?
I don't know.
I
I
mean,
mean,
I
we're
guess
always
we
just chatting, but is it too complicated to consider because it has to be applied so broadly? Is that what I'm hearing?
I don't know.
Okay.
Give me some time when we talk to the building folks, but I don't know that it has to be applied to everything.
Okay.
Also, I mean, you're proposing ordinances,
Sure.
Okay.
right? If you want to propose one that applies to everybody, then the
So-
board will decide,
Okay.
you know.
I guess what I'm thinking is, I mean, why if someone wants to do an agricultural building for vegetables, they are required to get a building permit, but cannabis doesn't?
Yeah, I would
That
complain
doesn't
if I was
seem
trying to
right.
do it one way and not the other. It
Yeah,
wouldn't work.
definitely.
Or if I want to multi-purpose my structure, if I want to grow cannabis in it, you know, one part of the year and grow vegetables another part of the year, then the rules shouldn't change.
Yeah. I mean, I look at it from a little bit of the aesthetic standpoint too. You know, when we're talking about unpermitted structures, people building, you know, hoop houses that kind of look funky. You know,
Sure.
we start to kind of go down that road that we see up in our northerly neighbor in Oregon. I mean, I do see the necessity to try to find a middle ground where these smaller greenhouse structures that we do use in cannabis, specifically just a black light out to pre-flower plants. But I mean, from my own aesthetic opinion, I'd hate to see just funky hoop houses bent in every single farm.
Sure.
I would prefer to see, you know, from my standpoint of where I think cannabis should be and where it can get to, is having, you know, legitimately beautiful looking structures. Having to force the farmer to build something that looks good isn't entirely out of the realm of possibility in my mind. I think, you know, I would prefer to be pushed into
Sure.
building something that looks aesthetically pleasing
Sure.
versus being able to just kind of build any funky little thing
So-
you want
so
to cover
Eric,
with plants.
What would you say that you're advocating for, kind of leave it alone, the current system is, I assume that's what the current ag policy is.
Yeah.
Some version of that.
I mean, I think for simplicity's sake, I mean, you know, I definitely appreciate the time the staff's put into it, but, you know, I mean, if if that's not something that can be changed easily, that would require a little bit more, you know, thought process with more of the departments involved, I think, you know, maybe we just suck it up and say, okay, I mean, if we're going to build a structure, we've got to get a permit for it. It's a simple permit.
Maybe it's not about not getting permits, but maybe we need to learn a little bit more from the building department about what is required.
There you
If it's
go.
not a big deal, if it's not expensive,
Right.
yes, public comment guy here. If it's not a big deal to get the permits, if we could find out a little bit more about what we can and can't do and what the requirements are.
Sure.
You know, I just don't know enough about it, you know, like some of the simple structures that we use to hold a piece of blackout plastic. If building code is going to require pouring a lot of concrete, for example, then it might become cost prohibitive to do these simple structures. So, but if that's not the case, if there's ways for the building department to permit things without it, you know, costing up-
Over-engineering.
Yeah, over-engineering, correct. Then it maybe it's fine. If there's a square footage under which we don't need engineering, for example, you know, maybe that works just fine and we can still get a permit.
I think you're kind of asking the planning department to change their strategy for cannabis, and I don't think that's going to happen.
I don't think it's
That's not
appropriate
our
to do that
job
either.
either. I think that's I mean, Heidi in planning is going to keep her job the same as it is right now. She's not going to change it because we have a T-post in
The
plastic.
reason why I'm getting to it is because as the more built out a farm is in timberland, I think the less you can argue that it's not going to interfere with future use of harvesting and growing timber. The more you have heavy concrete structures that are permanent, that are never going away, the more it's detracting from its use as timberland. I think you can definitely make that argument. And so that's why I'm bringing it up, because I think it's important for the farmers to understand, you know, at what point are we starting to get into development that's inconsistent with timberland? And if it's easy to get into that, then what we need to learn about is how to do the things we need to do without overdeveloping the timberland. And so that's why it's relevant to this ordinance, not because, you know, yeah, it's our job to learn about building code and what we can and can't do, and that doesn't have anything to do with the working group or the ordinance. That's just an applicant's responsibility. But if we're talking about general plan consistency and development in timberland, then it's definitely relevant.
Would it be possible to have a representative from the building department come in and kind of give just a quick little discussion on, you know, what they would consider a greenhouse permitted structure, the minimum requirements?
Sure. If, I don't know when we're going to do that, but if between now and then, if you guys want to put together some questions and send them to me, so whenever he comes here, he is a little, you know, very
Yeah,
prepared for
perfect.
the questions you have.
Certainly.
Okay, just, I'm going to touch on the agenda one more time for the new folks that came in late. Commercial cultivation in timberland, which we're on. Cannabis nurseries, with the idea that maybe they should be included in ag land, which is also what we're on. And then industrial hemp would be our third item.
On timberland, we could do the, talk about minimum lot size. If we have a little more freedom to consider existing timberland lot sizes, there's a lot of 5-acre lots.
Can you give me a quick summary of where we are from last time? We talked about the 2,500 and the 5,000.
Yeah, those are the two where they start, 2,500 square feet, and the next size, 5,000 square feet. We kind of were inclined to stop there. Unless conditions were perfect, I was suggesting possibly 10,000 square feet where you have paved road access. I think we decided to leave the grid part out of it, being a selling point. No, because there's a 10,000 square foot license, so yeah, just be whatever your maximum square footage is. I'm comfortable with those numbers.
And the minimum acreage size was 20 on everything?
We were stuck at 20, yeah, because of the general plan, but it sounds like we have more flexibility with that. And kind of the point of considering that was the fact that there are so many suitable lots that aren't quite 20. So that have been cut up in the past, you know, before these rules. So what's appropriate, you know, like?
I would think if, you know, based upon trying to move everything towards this ag forest designation, if we had even, whatever is basically you can get moved into ag forest, I think is appropriate. I don't know if it's even as small as 5 acres can be put into ag forest now, depending on all the talk back and forth about how
that's what
you're
they're talking
adjusting it.
about, existing parcels in timberland, whatever they are.
Yeah.
They're trying to find a way to create the language in the general plan that allows these existing parcels to move into the AF zoning, even though they're not 20 acres.
What are the smallest parcels you envision that could be put into AF, like that are out there right now that are possibly changing? Is it
Well, I guess.
obviously less than 20, but
What's the smallest out there? I mean, I'm not sure we'd have a limit if it's,
I mean, where you have, I mean, I would say primarily they're going to be 10 acres or larger in size. So you're going to find those areas like Rock Creek subdivision that has a PO zoning that has, I don't know exactly where I'm going with that.
those are.
But those are different areas,
residential.
and we would address
Yeah.
those separately because the underlying land use
There's
is
a good
different.
handful of 5s. There's a lot of 5s, and there's a couple of 2.5s, oddly enough. There's not very
Where
many
are
of
the
those.
5s? Up Low Divide?
Low Divide,
Really?
and there's out
Are those-
South Fork, I want to, or maybe those are 10s. But yes, they're long runway strips that they
Okay.
run quarter section
Okay.
lines.
Okay, I
and
was
then
thinking
we're-
those were 10s, but they're only 5s.
Yeah, and they're halved and
Okay.
halved and halved. And one of them got halved all the way down to 80 feet, and it's, you know, 2.5 acres of TPZ land. There's a couple of those. But 5s are relatively
I
common.
mean,
There's a lot
my
of,
guess in those areas that we would then want to make sure that we go down to 5 because those are the lots that we're trying to capture.
right, there's a lot of those that have county, they touch the road, the county road, and they were cut up in a way that they touch the road to be, you know, individually owned and accessed and such. So, and some aren't, you know, but there are enough 5s to consider that, perhaps, you know, at the smallest scale of cultivation.
Well, then
10s
maybe
at
minimum
least.
lot size isn't really a conversation that matters. Maybe
it
it's just
doesn't.
setbacks.
That's what I think. We've talked about that in other contexts too, that the lot size is not as relevant as the setbacks you can meet. So, and it'll just be defined by your setbacks.
But you said how wide are these strips?
Well, as narrow as 80 feet. Well, the 5 acres are about 165 feet, the narrow ones. So, I mean, a lot of them could get excluded by setbacks anyhow. The other reason for lot size is to control density. That was a method we used just to control overall density, the total number. I don't know if that's fair or appropriate in timberland. So this question, I think, does tie into density, space between them. There are places right adjacent to our parcels. There's a stack of 4 of these. And so it may not be appropriate to have 4 permitted farms all that close together. So perhaps this ties into space between permitted operations. If we're going to have a smaller setback when you're adjacent to like zoning, where there is no residential activity, we talked about that. But then you could get a situation where you have a bunch of farms real close to each other, which may or may not be good, I don't know.
I think you want to stay away from having some kind of ordinance that talks about space between farms, because what I would envision that doing is being everyone running to be the first to get a permit, right? Because if I don't get the permit first, I lose my chance in the future, right?
Kind of a neighbor versus neighbor
It's like
situation.
it's like
Right.
that would be pushing people into the business versus, you know, kind of what we were trying to get away from in the other sense of it. So I think maybe just the setbacks in general, and not worrying so much about.
Okay. The
lots.
board wants a cap, so we're going to probably just have to pick a number, because the board wants to see some kind of cap.
5,000. I just like to, whenever we say that, I just throw a number out. My hat.
No, a cap on the number of permits.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, 5,000, okay. Square footage, number of permits, we'll just use the same number for everything.
I think we should form a goal to acquire 20 acres of footprint. Not a cap, a goal you know, figure what we can get 5 acres, five
All
to
right.
7 jobs
Yeah,
per
reverse
acre.
it, right? We need a goal to get at least,
We need a certain amount to create a certain amount of jobs, right? So if it's 7
Right.
jobs per acre, we need 20 acres to create 140 jobs to create competition for the labor force here so that they have an economy to compete.
Is that based on anything good or defensible? I mean, seven jobs an acre, is that, where are you getting that? I mean, I like,
Arbitrary.
because if you got data or you got something, I'd love to.
I don't know.
From the numbers guy next
I'm
to
just
him.
guessing my butt off here. I don't know. I'm thinking if I
70 jobs per acre.
You think 70?
If you talk about from top to bottom, if you talk about from, you know, from the day the cutting is struck till the day somebody purchases the product, that's 70 people an acre,
So,
maybe 50.
But then part of that's happening outside our community where it's actually being sold and distributed.
No, I put a lot of thought into that. I'm really good at estimating, actually.
so what is the context of this
That's pretty
conversation?
close.
Why are we, why did we jump to a
Here's-
goal, I
Yeah,
guess?
here's what I see as actually being important. When you're looking at the smell of 1 or 2 or 5 grows kind of in an area, and you've got some setbacks, and it's out there, it's not, doesn't have the odor mitigation, and maybe it's not a big deal. Until at some point you've permitted enough that there's the cumulative impact of you drive down the highway and you smell it the way you do in Oregon, and that is what I hear people primarily against when they're expressing concerns about the ordinance. So, you know, it might not be a rule about how close they are together or anything like that. It might have to be a more flexible, you know, what's the cumulative impact of, you know, adding one more grow in an area? And it's kind of hard to quantify.
I do know that there are certain counties that have put a like canopy square footage limit. Maybe that's what Robert was trying to say, is that, you know, maybe we have a cap on square footage total canopy for the county, you know, cultivating.
Instead of individual license cap.
Instead of
you cap
individual
the square
license
footage.
caps, we just have a generalized amount that we do
Right.
not permit over a certain amount of cultivated square footage.
I would just say, I think our caps, you know, are to mitigate what happens in the Illinois Valley, which is, you know, again, I-99 or Y-99 and a lot of private land along that corridor. So we're just not going to have that on the Highway 101 with
true.
what we've done with
We don't have
limitations on setbacks and everything else, coastal zones. We're not going to have it on the 101, and we're not going to have it up the 199. It's going to be below divide,
Joel's making a
and
funny
it's going to
face.
be up South Fork. So we're mostly concerned with people who have had a traditional living, their little homesteads up there. You know, they don't want to have a stench. You know, I think that's the only thing. And environmental concerns. Are we leaching a watershed dry or anything like that? Other than that, I think our main concern should be job creation.
The small timberland lots are not clustered along the Highway 101. The private lots that are timberland along 101 are like 20 acres mostly. And there's the smaller sections I think have already been designated residential.
I would just say, you know, I mean, the supervisors can add a cap on. They can ask Joel to throw 20, you know, or whatever they want on there. I don't think we need to put a cap on it. I think we mitigated it with setbacks, small size.
So, you know,
natural
the
geography.
retail, not the retail, the cultivation, the indoor cultivation ordinance on ag and manufacturing, that came forward kind of in broad terms when I was just informing the board for that ordinance. There's a pretty good conversation about caps, and then I deleted the cap from that ordinance based on that conversation. So I'm not sure that this one is expected to have a cap either. I think the board kind of sees the difficulties in having a cap and putting staff in a position to decide who gets them or to create a horse race for them. And you know, kind of told them if we get to a place where we've got so many applicants and we're worried about these impacts, we just hit pause and come back to the board and say, look, here's the situation. 'Cause right now, we're not really sure what the situation is going to be. And you know, I think caps are pretty dodgy. Whether it's the number or the acreage or anything, it's kind of just a wild guess.
Let's talk setbacks then. That's like that kind
Well,
of creates the limits.
I guess I'd like to maybe follow up a little bit more on that, Joel. I'm trying to get my head around, we're spending a lot of time and effort with lots of meetings, over a couple of year period here to attempt to get something that's fairly firm because we believe that it's been vetted and works. And then the board comes along and says, no cap because of X, Y, Z. So, we're stuck with that. It doesn't mean that it's wrong to consider caps today. And so I guess I'm pushing back just a little, Joel, and maybe you can follow up on the part where you just said caps are a little dodgy. And what I'm thinking is what happens is the supervisors is 5 people that will change over time. And if we don't get some meat and potatoes in this thing, then it will change over time. And the variable won't necessarily be what we intended or what the current supervisors intended, and it'll be too loose. And so I guess I'm just advocating for structure and sound stuff that, numbers and policy and limits that are thought out.
Well, I've been telling the board pretty much from the beginning, pretty consistently, that I hate caps.
Yeah.
I think that puts us in a position to get sued. It puts us in a position of having to choose between people to pick winners and losers in the cap race. And so even when I put 30 caps in the last ordinance and took it to the board, they said, how'd you come up with 30? And I said, it's just a number I thought we'd never get to, right? It's kind of an arbitrary number that I don't think we're going to get to because I don't ever want us to get to the cap. So if we have to have a cap, I want to set it so high that we're never going to get sued over it.
That's probably why I said 5,000.
Right. The same is really the case with the kind of request for proposals, request for qualifications, kind of pilot program thing that other people did. Whereas, we're going to have to develop some sort of criteria to decide the winners and losers when really what we would like to do is decide what impacts we're going to mitigate. And once we've mitigated those, let the market figure out the rest. And so I think these ordinances are already so stringent. I think we're looking at possibly an inviable industry anyway.
I agree with what you're saying there on that, Joel. What we're talking about here, I've been coming at this conversation that we're not establishing a cap. That's why we're talking about small numbers and, a lot of setbacks, which naturally limit stuff. I think putting a cap in place creates the race to fill the cap number, right? If it's known out there that there's only 50 permits, and if I have any inclination that I want to do this, I'm going to go get that permit. I'm going to start right now because tomorrow I could maybe not have the ability to do it. So if we're going to talk about a cap, then I'm going to be sitting here at the table going, I want 100,000 square foot because depending on what cap number we're talking about, right? So I think the small numbers, the good setbacks naturally limit that, and then, in the future, hey, we're getting too many people, everything's filling up pretty fast, like Joel says, let's put pause on it, let's figure out how to readjust this down the road. But I think the cap it's like the space between operations, it pushes you into getting your license right now.
I will say that, I agree completely with that because if there were a cap, I would rush to try to get things together quick enough so that I could be in place for a permit. And I know anybody else that I know of that would be interested in getting a permit in this county would do the same thing. And I do think that is creating what we've tried to avoid this whole time, which is a rush to grab up whatever is capable and move forward.
I would think anybody that owns TPZ property, if there was a cap, would immediately go buy it, right? Just if you had the ability to, be outside of a bank control, and I want that now because I want the ability to have flexibility with my property.
Yeah. Truly, I would love to see just a robust capability for this industry in the county. And I do know that, we've heard a lot of concerns from the community, from the supervisors, from everybody who's been involved, that they don't want to see the type of rush that they saw in Oregon, in Washington, Colorado. I work for a management consulting company in Oregon, and we manage 6 different farms, about 190,000 square foot of canopy coverage. It's kind of gross. There's a part of it that it just doesn't feel right. I mean, you do what you do because you do what you do. But I would hate to see that in this county. And, you know, a lot of these people rushed in the end, bought up properties that were local. And now we've got farms on them that aren't even owned by local people. They're owned by people who live in another state, a couple of them from another country. And I'd hate to see that for Del Norte County. I don't think that's where I started from for this, is I got involved because I didn't want to see what I saw starting to develop in Oregon, here, where I live. You know, I think that creating caps would basically start that race off. I think the market structure and the viability of the land that we have available is going to keep our industry here in control. I don't think we'll have, you know, the widespread that if we have proper setbacks, if we have proper things to mitigate those concerns, I think that's the way to go, if we can figure that part out.
I think the pace at which the county will be able to process permits also will function as a cap. If the planning commission is meeting once a month, the board is meeting once every couple of weeks, how many permits can they possibly approve in a year anyway?
Not that many.
So let me weigh in quickly. I was in a meeting in Sacramento 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago, and talking with it's Farm Bureau, State Farm Bureau, so there's reps from every county in California, and a couple of them mentioned that, you know, there's caps on the coast, and I don't know if it's Monterey to San Luis Obispo, but in some of those counties in there, and they just thought that, you know, it's real important that you limit the number of permits. Now, I don't know if we've got so many categories of permits, I don't know which one applies. But yet, that being said, I hear what you guys are saying, and I understand we do not want to create this false, you know, closing of a window that everyone's going to attempt to jump through before it closes. That's wrong, and I've seen that in other industries, and, you know, then you artificially have this wave of new permits or permittees, and, you know, that can be equally as ugly. So I'm open-minded to this. I just kind of want to, you know, reiterate that we're talking commercial cannabis here, and if I wasn't in the middle of this and I was outside or looking in and knowing that there's different categories, well, gosh, commercial seems like the one that you would want to limit, right? Yeah, and so you all are saying, well, you're real comfortable with the limiting of commercial cannabis by maintaining the 2,000 or 2,500 feet and the 5,000, and then the 10,000 got thrown in today, or have we already agreed to that?
Well,
We had
talked
discussed
about
it, yeah, we had discussed
yeah.
it. We hadn't
So-
thrown it in there, but we
Yeah.
had discussed it previously just for properties.
And the one thing about that, Blake, those counties that you're talking about, I would be interested to learn further, because I know several of them have a very large square footage ability for those permits, and so
Yeah, they're big.
that's where I'm talking about. Yeah, let's talk about a cap if we're talking about a 250,000 square foot permit,
Yeah.
right? Let's not let 50 of those happen, but when we're talking about a couple thousand square foot, that's where I'm coming from, where I don't think the cap is something that's going to affect anything. And then those counties like Salinas and whatnot, they have huge abilities to get giant permits, and yeah, they want to limit those.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Kurt. That
state
makes sense. I
has
just wanted to
caps.
get all that on the table so that we're aware of what we're doing. And we're doing it for a purpose so that then it has more, I guess, we want to increase the odds of the package that we send to the Board of Supervisors of getting it to go through and stamped and become more of a formal rule as opposed to something that they're going to flippantly change all the time.
The state also has caps by watershed, the number of, the total canopy in a particular watershed, and then they'll stop issuing plant ID tags, basically, is how they limit that if a watershed's overtaxed.
You know, I've looked at that. I couldn't figure out any indication what that limit would be, right? It's kind of an evaluation of when there's
It's like
negative
water board
impacts.
science, you know, estimating how much water usage is and how much
Yeah.
water there is.
I would just treat that as a make-believe cap.
Okay.
Wherever the state decides to put it, it's gonna be long after it's pissed everybody off here. You know, I mean, it's just,
Okay, duly noted.
so I mean, I do agree with Blake that limiting it is important, because this thing has to work, right? This is the shot that the industry gets. If this doesn't work, the community says, well, you tried it and it failed.
And we'll try again.
I just think that kind of going back to that cumulative impacts idea is a way to keep it, you know, I'm not so much even thinking about the number or the size or the amount of cannabis, but the kind of the taking over of a sense of cannabis in the area. There's kind of a sense of cannabis in Oregon when you're there. It is what people really don't want.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have Cal Fire uses I think it's called the wildland urban interface zone, and it's where density is greater than one structure per 5 acres, and that becomes like the Cal Fire responsibility area. So there's like a metric like that. Is that what you're saying? Like in terms of density clustering, you come up with a number, or is it just a
I don't know, because I'm not even saying it's a density issue.
Okay.
It might be the opposite of density. We might want to segregate these, you know?
I don't know what do you mean?
I think kind of like some sort of like finding. I keep coming back to these flexible findings of the Planning Commission so that you can take an evidence of whether or not this 7th permit in this area is going to push you over the edge into something. And I'm just talking here. I'm not proposing anything. I haven't thought about
I
this.
can kind of understand that. I mean, you know, so take, you know, you're driving down 199, you're driving up to Oregon, and you get into the Gasky area. I mean, I think fortunately for us, there's not a lot of development potential on the corridor of 199 or 101. And so, you know, I don't see it being something where we're going to be driving down the road and see 15 farms on 199.
You're saying we're going to start to smell it before it's too late. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
The smell's going to be a hard thing to get away from.
If we start to smell it, maybe it's already too late. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying if the permit process is rolled out really slowly, you know, they can only approve so many permits at a time. And so the smell is going to increase incrementally slowly as well. So we'll have time to notice it starting to get too stinky before it gets so stinky that it's too late. Maybe that makes more sense.
So I mean, that's ideal, unless the only 10 permits we get are 10 contiguous properties.
All at the same time.
All at the same time.
Right.
It would be great if before we have to permit anything, we know whether or not the neighboring operation has gone through a cycle and smelled bad. That might, you know, not be how it works.
Well, let's talk setbacks then. You know, for smell, highway setbacks, we talked about 200 feet. We talked about visual barrier being part of the selling point with the permit. But did we decide we wanted some solid numbers for things like public highway? We had one for residential. We talked about 1,000 feet from residential.
Yeah, we talked about
what about
national forest and national
Yeah, so should we get some numbers
setbacks
settled if we don't already? You got numbers in your notes?
I can't remember if we settled. I think I like 200 feet from a highway.
Okay, and that's kind of what I have
Is
too.
that adequate? I'm just thinking when I happen to smell it and I look around, I don't see anything that's going from here south, not necessarily the Oregon route.
It's going to be different for different highway because like all county, you're going to eliminate entire 10-acre parcels from like a county road if you say 200 feet. So highway makes sense to have like 199 be different than.
Well, I guess it goes back to what Joel's saying. It does depend, possibly depends on volume, but I know right now that 200 feet is acceptable for, a couple 1,000-foot operations, because I can tell you that you drive right by it and you don't smell it, and I know it's there.
Right.
Right? I know.
Sure.
So I guess it depends on the cumulative effect, like Joel's talking about. How do we gauge the cumulative effect if there's 20 permits in that small kind of area and they're all 200 feet from the highway? Well, I don't know if you ever really can until it happens. I mean, it's an unknown. There's no way to know that until it happens. But 200 feet right now is acceptable on a couple 1,000-foot outdoor grow because it's happening and nobody knows where it is.
The highways that are sensitive, like we got 197, 199, 101, they're just, I'm pretty familiar with the cut up of timberland lots. And there really aren't very many small parcels on those thoroughfares. They're big lots, which means you're going to have space between them automatically without saying so.
So are you saying they can support larger setbacks? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that there's not going to be very many of them, so that a small setback would be appropriate.
There's not a need for
Or
setbacks, what he's
conversely, they
saying.
could support larger setbacks, maybe a little bit of both. I don't know. But you like to have one number for everywhere, I know. So that's.
I do. Everything's
Right.
easier when you have one number.
So in that sense, you know, if it's just a bunch of 20-acre parcels and you're capping it at 5,000 square feet, you're not going to have a, you know, Cave Junction density problem creating a lot of odor. 200 feet's sufficient for that kind of space. 20-acre parcels, you're going to have, you know, good 500 feet between operations at the closest. That's assuming that all these parcels are even doing it. We know the way things are going in the market. It's getting increasingly difficult, increasingly more expensive to operate. They're just dropping like flies all over the place.
Well, to allow it outdoors in anywhere, any place, you're going to have the smell. And so you can't regulate your ordinance by the smell, because like you say, if there's two 20-acre parcels and they both decide to plant next to each other within the different, you know, variants of how far away they can be and or how far from the highway, there could be double the smell, and it could float depending on your wind and depending on your heat and depending on all kinds of things. I think we can only do an ordinance to our best ability with setbacks, zone designations, that kind of a thing for the outdoor crop, because no matter what, there's gonna be smell.
I'm in agreement with that.
Yeah, I'm in agreement.
That seems like common sense to me.
Yeah.
So there's other places, like in our neighborhood on Low Divide, where there are concentrations of small lots where you probably would smell it from the gravel road, you know, but does anyone care? I don't know. You know.
Well, you'll still have your traditional nuisance analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Are you know, messing up your neighbor's quiet enjoyment? I'm not so worried about that. I'm worried about 199, 197.
Yeah.
I'm worried about people hiking. I'm worried about tourists.
Okay.
I'm worried about those types of things.
199, 197, just my 2 cents is that several hundred feet is perfectly fine to mitigate that concern based upon the fact that it happens now and it's not a problem, nobody knows it, and that there's not that many lots that are going to qualify in all those places to begin with. So the cumulative
that's the
effect of
biggest
putting like 20 of them together isn't really possible because the lots aren't available.
Sure.
Are those considered state roads, state highways, like, or are they, how does that designation work? Can we have different setbacks for different road systems here? Because 200 feet doesn't work on Low Divide.
On a highway.
Well, Low Divide's a county highway, it's Highway 305. But it's not a state highway, it's a county highway.
We
Oh,
can
wow.
say state highway. Our general plan specifically addresses the 3 state highways.
Okay,
And has specific policies for scenic resources.
okay. So we want a set,
And that's 97, 197, 99, and 101.
Yeah.
okay, so if we have 200 feet there, do we want to do we want to have a setback on other county roads of some kind? It seems like we have something.
So, yeah, a minimum of like 200 or so, but
Well, I'm
then-
saying 200 is too much.
Oh, that's too far.
For rural county roads with parcels that are along the road, you're going to wipe out the entire parcel and go all into the national forest with 200 feet.
Yeah, because you're gonna have the 200 on the
Yeah.
national forest, it'd be,
Yeah, and then we have a setback from the national forest too of something, you know, and like that eliminates every
maybe it
parcel.
should just be visual on the county road.
Yeah, we did talk about that too. National forest setback at 200, I think is
Yeah, we did.
too much.
I think we talked about having 200 for parks.
Parks.
Less.
And lower
No, that's
for the
1,000
forest.
for parks because the state has 600 at least, and I thought they changed it to 1,000, so
All right, I'm
parks are
fine with that.
1,000, but
If
just
we were
the
gonna-
national forest.
Talking about a setback maybe from a road like that, I would be saying like if we're going to have one, maybe it's like 50 feet in visual impairment, something like that.
Yeah.
You know?
That's what I would think, something like 50 feet for both national forest and county, smaller county roads besides the ones that we talked about. 100 feet at the most, because otherwise it's just, you're going to eliminate all the suitable zones.
Are there any existing setback requirements from a county road for any structure currently?
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
well, there's like, you know,
Yeah.
front yard type
Yeah.
stuff.
front- your
And it
yard,
depends
yeah.
on your zone district.
Okay.
So, yeah, typically, The lowest in our urban areas, we have some areas that have even 15 feet, but that's based on existing development patterns, but typically it's 25 feet. But in agriculture, larger lots, you're going to get a slightly larger setback, but not
It's like
probably any
30
more than
feet
50.
or something on the front.
Yeah, 30 feet, yeah.
I do think that, the county roads are where we'll probably, have the largest nuisance complaints, I'm going to piggyback off of what Kurt said earlier about the, the 197, 199, and 101 corridor areas. There are not a lot of viable properties. I drive up 199 pretty much every day. And, I for years I've been looking at these lots thinking to myself, if cannabis ever became an industry, would this one be something that somebody would want to do? And literally, I could count them on one hand, ones that I feel are viable as a farmer, somebody who's in the industry. I just don't see a lot of viability, particularly on 199. And 101, we're dealing with the agricultural zone district as we get a little bit past Fort Dick there. And 197 is just, I don't really see a capability there for outdoor farming per se.
It's a lot of residential.
It's a lot of residential land, a lot of homes stacked up on each other. I think they're mostly built off of smaller parcels off of that highway system, So I just, I don't know if we're barking up a tree that doesn't necessarily have a bear in it or not, but
we need some number
talk
for
about
county
it.
roads, I think.
I think county, and that's where that was the gist of what I was getting at.
Okay.
I think county roads are where we really should be thinking about the impact of, the local citizens who are driving by. If we establish a sizable distance off a state highway of 200 feet, I'll throw my parcel out there. You drive by it 60 miles an hour, you'll never see it. You have to literally look through a 200-foot stand of trees.
We're talking about smell more, I think, though. Like if there's accumulation of farms that were 200.
But that's what I mean, though. On 199, we're not going to see a cumulative effect of farms stacked up next to each other.
I think you're exactly right.
Imagine the property zones as you leave through, the forest land.
We need some number on the highways, though, right, Joel?
We should have something, but
Okay,
I'm just
so
saying.
you're saying maybe
I don't know
100 feet? 100?
Hmm?
You're saying 100 feet then, maybe?
For distance from a state highway?
Yeah.
I'm okay with 200 feet.
Oh, okay. 200
I think
is
that's,
good then.
like I said, I think that's a decent sizing.
Okay.
And if I imagine myself driving down the highway and I'm peering through the trees to see something going 50 miles an hour, I have a hard time differentiating what's there. The smell, again, is a cumulative effect. If we're talking about limiting a 20-acre parcel potentially to, say, a 10,000 square foot maximum size, I work on a farm, with 40,000 square feet daily, and it's 200 feet from a road in Oregon, and you can't smell it. It blends in with all the other smells. Now, there's a density problem in Oregon where you have farms stacked on top of each other, but my point being, on the 199 corridor, we're not going to have that.
You
There's
wouldn't
just
want to
not
see
enough available property on the highway to cultivate.
Yeah. Joel, you wouldn't want to see like different setbacks for larger operations. That'd be unnecessarily complicated. If you're going to permit a larger operation, it needs a larger setback from the highway.
I like simplicity.
Okay. So 200 feet, that's good, state highway. County highway, 50 feet, 100 feet, what should we?
I would think 50 feet would be
I like
sufficient.
50 feet.
Everyone
okay with
I'd
that?
like to hear from Blake because, I think Blake's got a lot of good
Heidi,
things to say, and I
that
would
sound
like to
okay?
hear from his counterpoint what he feels 50 feet on a county road would be.
Okay.
Well, here's an idea.
I got
about
5
the-
more things on my list I want numbers for before we go.
Well, here's an idea quickly about your county road, highway, whatever, setback thing, 50 foot, right? So we're talking about 50 foot and probably also a visual impairment, right? You can't just see it. And so then that rolls into there's a possibility that your operation may need some fencing. And we always have had this kind of hang up about, well, how do we control the fencing, right? So that would probably be something that you would put into your permit request through the planning department, whatever, right? Approval of your fencing, right?
Your
before
visual
permit.
mitigations.
Yeah,
Visual
like, I'm
mitigations.
going to have X type of fence.
For trees or
And if that's
greenhouse
not
or-
good, then you're not getting approved. Like there needs to be a metric maybe that the county would use for that situation, or just that they would approve your type of fencing. You wouldn't just say, I'm going to have a black plastic fence,
Well,
You know, I put a pretty flexible standard in the ag and manufacturing ordinance, which is you have to show what measures you're taking to conceal or mitigate both visual and smell. And it can't, you have to hide the indicia of cannabis cultivation. So no big black fences. Like, you know, if you're growing on 199 and you're 250 feet, you obey the setback, but we can still see you. Maybe your proposal isn't a big black fence. Maybe it's you plant a row of trees. You know, maybe you position your building somewhere else on your property. You know, it should be flexible enough that we don't have to accidentally force people to put up a particular type of structure or fencing that is going to become associated with cannabis grows.
Go ahead.
I think that 50-foot, you might encounter that a little bit more than the 200-foot setback. The 200-foot off a road, you're probably rarely going to have an issue with that type of thing.
So I guess I'd like to ask,
Public comment.
oh,
I would love to see that.
yeah. You're talking about a tarp, like, yeah. Black, blue, green, brown.
Yeah.
So we did discuss that in prior meetings about, you know, the visual aesthetic requirement for fencing, but I think
Joel's going to make
We
it
did
pretty,
go
so
over
we're just relying on Joel.
Yeah, no black fences. Yeah, but blue, green, yellow, red, all those colors, right? No stupid fences. Just smart ones. So I guess, Heidi, if we're talking, back to the concept of 50 feet from a county road, in county roads, I think sometimes the property is the center of the county road with an easement through it. So
Typically, I think those are most, well, I think
not necessarily?
Not necessarily. Usually
Okay.
there's a road right-of-way, which could be,
Yep.
you know, your road base might be 30 feet, but your road right-of-way might be 60 feet, and then
Yep.
we would be making the measurement from the edge of the right-of-way
Right.
onto your property.
That makes
I
sense.
don't know. But there are some properties where, especially on private rural roads, where the center line is the center of the road with each property
Yeah.
owner owning part
And
of
that's
it.
why I'm bringing that up, because I know that's the case. And, you know, 50 feet at that point is crazy too close.
I think we should just always go from the right-of-way edge, because the county roads always have a right-of-way, right?
Yes.
And so we always measure from the outer edge of the right-of-way,
I would agree with that.
and that eliminates what you're talking about. This can come up on private roads, that's a different discussion.
Yeah.
Joel has some language about express permission from other users on a private road, but that's separate, I think. But I do get what you're saying, it would end up right on the roadside if you measured it from the middle of the road.
So,
Okay, we got.
I don't know, if 50 feet does sounds pretty close.
Didn't we do something like for the indoor? Wasn't it like 200 feet from the county road for the indoor on the ag land? We had a big old setback from the public road.
I don't remember, but that sounds familiar.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
believe I remember that.
It might have only been 100, but I can't.
That's because we're trying to like protect the ag character. I think timberland's a little bit
Sure.
different. It's not quite the same, but I could see situations where, but 50, the numbers, what Joel's more I think what he's talking about is this, you know, project proposal process, I think, is the way we determine kind of at that point what actually is the right setback.
Right, with a baseline.
With a
Right?
baseline
With a baseline
to start with.
codified number, and then
Right.
on top of that, it's the community forum that says, no, in this
Sure.
neighborhood, that's too close.
Sure. So I think, so what about national forest? We talked about 200. I think that's way too far for the middle of nowhere. I think something like 50 feet, again, is appropriate. That gives enough buffer for inaccuracies of survey lines, inaccuracies of Forest Service posts and things that gets you well onto your property.
And they're
Well-
usually treed and separated.
Oftentimes, yeah.
A general, all-purpose 50 feet from every property line setback would be, I think, a nice baseline. And then you add your higher levels, your 200, your 1,000, based on
Okay.
other things.
Sounds good. So we can extend that to maybe your undeveloped timberland neighbors. We had a different number for properties that have a residential use permit in the timberland, and
So-
those could be, should be considered residential zones potentially.
Joel, for clarity, what you just proposed there would be a general setback, always, minimum, everywhere, of 50 feet.
Yeah. Yeah. Because even in, like, the ag ordinance, I think it was 50 feet, because that's what the existing building
Ag
setback.
buildings,
The
right.
manufacturing didn't have that, but
Right.
that's, you know, for reasons.
Okay.
This would give you, even if you have two properties cultivating next to each other,
It'd still be
you're still gonna get at least 100 feet between them.
So we got 1,000 feet from residential zoned areas or that are designated residential. Is everyone all right with that? Does that sound right? 1,000 feet?
Yep.
And then parks, 1,000 feet, state and national parks. And then we talked about timberland properties where they have an active use permit for residents need to be considered something. Is that a residential, is that the same 1,000 feet or is it something less? I think we didn't really come to a conclusion on that one. And then the other thing we didn't talk about is that right now in PO zoning, residential houses are principally permitted. And I think AF it's like that too. But what happens there if you're in a zone where housing's principally permitted, you build a house with no permit, you're not violating any use permit. You just didn't get a permit for a principally permitted use, but your residence is still a legit dwelling, right? I mean, in terms of like,
It needs a building permit, but
It
yeah.
still would require a building permit.
sure, but I mean, in terms of honoring
Yeah,
what we're
it's
talking
illegal,
about
it would be
is-
a legal conforming use. It would,
Right.
yeah, it's a principally permitted use,
Okay.
unlike.
Sure, so there's a lot of that. There's a lot more of that than there are use permits for houses in timberland. So that should
Safe
probably
zone.
come up in the ordinance at some point.
If it's principally permitted, then, you know, that's just something that's gonna happen
Okay, do we need
near
to put
cannabis
a,
cultivation.
so then, we have 1,000-foot setback we want from residential areas. Are we calling that a residential area now?
No, I would keep
Okay.
to residential zoned areas.
Okay, all right.
Like rural residentially zoned properties or.
So there are potentially parcels where someone may apply for a use permit where they have a home that doesn't have a permit?
Correct.
And then the
Right.
question would be, okay.
Do you,
They
the
would
question
pay
is,
for a
does
use
the county
permit.
require them to get a permit for that residence? I think that would be the,
Well, do we give them different consideration for setback is kind of what we're talking about here. I got these 6 points.
Yeah, I know
where we
you're
want
talking
them
about
to-
setbacks, but now I'm thinking you're coming for a permit from us and you need to get a building permit, but that's something I guess will be a separate subject.
Right, they may not be.
You mean
Well, let-
if they have a totally unrelated to the cultivation structure on their property that doesn't have a building permit?
I'm talking about neighbors, not your own property.
Oh,
Honoring setbacks for residential areas
You're
on your
talking a
neighbors.
neighboring, I was
Yeah.
thinking that the actual
Right, so you
person,
have a neighbor who's got a house. It's not a residential zone, but houses are principally permitted. Some people have pulled a use permit.
So what you're saying is your neighbor afforded a setback
Yes.
because they have the structure there, even if their home is not permitted?
Or if it is permitted.
If it's
two
permitted,
different
I would think,
questions.
yeah, then you
Okay.
would, but I think if it's not permitted, I don't know why you would be afforded the luxury of
Okay.
getting the setback.
Okay, then let's talk about setbacks from people who have permits for residential structures in timberland. Is that going to be considered, do you need more than 50 feet?
What did we do in
It's not
ag?
residential.
I would think it would be
Residential zone.
similar.
It's not residential, it's like a neighboring property of like zoning.
I believe the context of what we were talking about with that residential was specifically what Joel had just mentioned. It was a residential zone.
Okay.
Residentially zoned properties. Well, in a PO property, a residence is a primary permitted use. It's not a residentially zoned
Okay.
property.
All right.
I believe that's
True, I just didn't know if we were going to give extra consideration to somebody who's living in the
Yeah,
woods.
what we considered in ag is a little bit different though, because we've also talked basically about a lot of smell mitigation and everything else
Right.
with structures. And so now we're talking about completely outdoor, unmitigated smell with a potential house being a few hundred feet from your property line or something like that, right? And that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, that could be a problem. I mean, if you've got a nice place and you built a house and you don't necessarily want cannabis farm next to it, maybe you should be afforded more than 50
And so I think
feet.
that,
I don't know.
that you probably just need to think more about property line setbacks in general, because what you're saying is that, okay, today,
We're at 50
there may not be there may not be a house, but tomorrow, if it's
Sure.
potentially permitted, the property owner goes and pulls a permit and builds a house, and your permit is,
Oh.
up for reconsideration all the time, so that would affect maybe your business. So, 50 feet from your own property line may be just as sufficient as anything.
Let the neighbor complain when you file for your permit, I guess.
We'll probably run into this a little bit. I mean, as these farms start to prop up on properties that don't have a permitted dwelling, even though there is a residence there, I mean, the hope would be that these people are successful enough to, re-engage with the county and get their building permitted and reassess the value of the property again, which is another avenue for revenue stream for the county.
We'll write that in.
We'll write
hope
in
section.
hopes of, just in hopes of.
So what would be the difference between them having a house and not having a house, like with the 50-foot?
I'm
We have a
saying
different setback?
we throw out something large, I mean, a larger setback, but then you get into a situation where if your neighbor doesn't even care, nobody cares, and then you're bound by this larger setback. Let's say we made it 200 feet, right? But then nobody cares, and now your place is ruined because your only place you have is within 200 feet. So maybe just,
I think we should consider that, it is timberland and it's kind of intended by the county for natural resource extraction, which in my mind is consistent with economic.
right. You could set up a sawmill next to your neighbor's house and cut logs all day long, and they couldn't really stop you.
I think we should consider, this is an economic.
Okay, perfect. Move on.
So, your neighbor will get mailed notice of your use permit application. They'll have the opportunity to come. And they will always be protected by basic nuisance ordinances. So if you're there, you're 50 feet away, but you are creating a significant smell, code enforcement is still going to come and respond to that complaint.
Okay.
So I would say keep it at 50, but, realistically, that cultivator is going to have a really hard time doing anything if he's not, being a good neighbor, which is always kind of true.
We talked about requiring living on the property. The Humboldt Artisanal brand, I think, has that in their ordinance. I don't know if that's something you were inclined to want to figure out how to make language for or not, how to define that.
I wouldn't go.
I like the idea of it, but I don't know if it's feasible.
I don't necessarily like the idea of mandating that, I mean, are we talking about
Telling you where to
mandating
live.
a majority owner to be on site, or are we just considering, requiring a resident on site for
I don't
more
know.
security reasons?
Well, yeah, this gets to security. That was one of the things we haven't talked about at all, is security. So is that, from the security standpoint, maybe that's what we're looking for?
Like a resident requirement. Oregon has that in place. You have to have a
Okay.
resident on site. It doesn't have to be an owner. It just has to be, either an employee. It actually doesn't even have to be an employee. It just has to be a residence that's on site, has to be lived in.
Okay.
To act like a caretaker and.
It's kind of like a caretaker, kind of like a security person, somebody who's just on site all the time. Now, in Oregon, they're requiring, and again, let me just throw this out there, all the fences we see in Oregon, those are all going to be coming down. If you're a licensed recreational farm in Oregon, you actually are required to have a fence, and it cannot be a blue fence. It has to be a solid structure wooden fence or a solid structure metal paneled fence. There are requirements for, for security reasons for that. I don't know if that's something, I tried to find this actually.
There are no fence requirements I could find in CDFA at all.
And that was something that, I thought about because, working behind a secure fence is also a secure feeling for an employer, an employee. You're secure, you feel safe, you don't feel exposed. And I'll say, in the Oregon marketplace for years and years, there was a lot of rip-offs on a lot of different OMMP farms, which is the medical growing farms. A lot of those were substandardly secured, and the price points for the cannabis in the black market was very high. So it was much more enticing for people to come and steal your crop. What we've seen in the last 2 years, and this is backed up by data collected by the OLCC, is that the actual thievery of cannabis has dropped 70% since the implementation of the recreational cannabis laws. So we, in the Cave Junction Valley area, normally year after year you'd see 50 to 60 farms being ripped off, normally by a small band of people. They were pretty much the same consistent group. We haven't seen one yet this year. Last year there were 2. So what we're starting to see is that the marketplace is actually working itself out. Now visually we don't like what we see from Oregon, but what we're seeing from a safety standpoint is that some of the regulations that they've implemented requiring fencing, requiring these cameras all over the place, is actually lessening the safety impact for employees, for surrounding neighborhoods. You know, surefire gunshots going off just to keep people away from your farms is not happening. I remember nights it would just, I mean, I live on the California border side, but you could hear the gunshots off in the O'Brien area ring through the valley, and it would be, you'd hear 5,000 bullets being shot, you know, every time before dusk. And it was just, you know, guys going out there just making their presence known. So I just wanted to throw that out there. From the safety standpoint, what we're starting to see with fencing and requirements, it's lessening tremendously. And so maybe it's something we as a county might want to consider.
What do you think about fence requirement, Joel?
I don't so
Like
much
security
care.
fencing.
Yeah, I don't care. I think it just comes back to what do those fences look like? And, you know, you put together an application, you got your operation plan, and you say, this is the fence I'm going to build.
I just
And
meant,
then,
like,
and
does
then the
county
community
have
and the neighbors show up and say, no, that fence is too ugly, or whatever.
I was meaning, like, does the county have an interest in requiring a security fence?
I don't know. Keep in mind that these are all going to be public information, like where your grow is public knowledge. So maybe.
Eric, in Oregon, what are those fences going to be replaced by anything, or just they're coming down?
Basically, what you're going to see is that the change of the zoning laws in relationship to what you can and can't grow on rural residential properties in Oregon, you're going to see a lot of these farms in the next year go down, or just drop down to 6 plants. The requirement for the OLCC now and the OMMP is they're tied in together. You have to join into their track and trace program if you're going to grow any more than 6 plants on any property, whether it be for personal recreational or for your combined recreational 4 plants and your say you're going to grow another 6 plants because you have an OMMP card, so you'd have 10. Well, you'd have to be in track and trace at that point, the metric system for Oregon. And those rural residential properties currently can have more than that, but they've changed that law. That law is now an ordinance that's requiring that those farms basically go down to 6 plants or join in the track and trace. And most of those people don't want to do that. They've tried to avoid that. So.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to ask the public, anybody have any comments on this subject right now? We're good?
There's one last thing I wanted to cover on the
Sure,
timberland before we move on, and that's the vegetative space, your nursery space. The state doesn't limit that. I think other counties do, because like in Humboldt, when you apply for your square footage permit, you're applying for your square footage for your whole operation, and then how you fit that into your state license is between you and the state. So I'm thinking it might be appropriate to have a cap on your vegetative space in association with your permit, because it's not limited by any number anywhere else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we did discuss that the last one a little bit,
I don't think
about
it's
how the diversion
right.
of plant counts can happen through over nursery stock production, because.
So I was thinking like 1-to-1, like if you have a 2,500 square foot permit, you probably don't need more than 2,500 square foot of nursery space. That's probably generous.
That's copious amounts.
Could you quickly maybe give me an upgrade on the difference between vegetative space and canopy space?
Sure, yeah, when you apply for your permit from the state, 2,500 square foot permit, that's your production area, that's your flowering area. So once your plants enter flowering, there's a definition once it's the half an inch across or something, the flower structure. Then it's called a mature flowering plant. It has to be tagged at that point in the track and trace system. And then it has to fit within your defined square footage. That's your production area. Now your nursery stock that you're supplying your production area doesn't count against your square footage with the state. So you could have a big veg, and so one of the things we thought of was well, that could be a potential point of abuse or diversion.
And the nursery stock is what you're referring to as vegetative.
Yeah, your plants before they're mature, before they start to flower.
flowering, yeah.
Correct.
Yep. Now, I
So
do
your
know
that's your propagation, that's your, in between
the
stage.
nursery space and nursery stock is really kind of correlated between how you plan to fill up your canopy space.
Yeah, it's all going to vary. I'm just thinking of a cap.
There are certain ways, certain farmers I think are going to take advantage of the single plant separational aspect of California's. If you're separated by 10 feet, it's not a continuous canopy. So
Right.
there will be people who decide to just grow one single plant in one big pot and separate each one of those pots by 10 feet.
Yeah, you don't need a
So
big
10
veg
feet in between
space.
each plant in a row, and then a walkway space of 10 feet, and then another row of 10 plants, or plants separated by 10 feet. That way you don't require as many plants to fill up. Now, there will be people who decide to throw it in the ground and do row crop style. In order to fill up a large canopy on a 200-foot row, you're going to plant twice as many plants as you would in that. And so it might be hard to define where we're coming from to the farmer, how many plants are going to be necessary in a
I don't think you need to
nursery
get that
stock
detailed
situation.
with it. I'm saying just a workable maximum that
Yeah.
fits everyone in. And that's why I was saying a 1-to-1 ratio should allow all the room you'd ever need, but doesn't allow blatant abuses of overuse of a veg space. So if you're
Right.
your
you're
style,
2,500 square
you might
foot,
only need
2,500
500 square
square
feet.
foot,
You know,
right.
if you're doing an intensive multiple crop light deprivation,
Mm-hmm.
you might want to utilize the 1-to-1 ratio. But I can't see, I'm just asking as another
Yeah.
farmer if there's a situation where somebody could legitimately need to utilize a larger vegetative space than that. And
For a short time or for an ongoing
yeah, even
time?
for a short time, and at the peak of it, you can get to that 1-to-1 state. You might want to have as much space for your vegetative plants, and then they move in that same shape and position into the flowering space and occupy the same amount of space, but for a short time. I just can't see a situation where you would need more than your permitted space for vegetative operations unless you were trying to
market it somewhere else.
produce more, or if you're just trying to produce an overage, like you want to produce 25% more plants than you need, you do need that, but going double would be
Well, you
ridiculous.
definitely could have situations where you wanted more than 1-to-1, but then that's the whole point of why the county would maybe want to limit that, right? Because, I
Right.
mean, if you're doing light deprivation, like you're saying, you would have one greenhouse you're doing your light depo on, which is your flowering, which is your 2,500 or whatever square foot that you're allotted. And then your vegetative space, you could have another same exact sizing,
Right.
vegetatively growing plants getting ready for the next light depot as soon as that one was
Can
done. And that
rotate
would
from
be
greenhouse to
1-to-1.
greenhouse.
Right.
And at that same moment, you would want like some baby plants or some young
Yeah,
plants
right, your
somewhere else. And
propagation
then, so that would
space.
exceed your 1-to-1.
Sure.
Right, in that scenario. But, without establishing that, you could, with light deprivation, you could have, your 2,500 square foot, you could have 5 or 10,000 more square foot of vegetative space that you're just getting ready to just light depot and roll right on through it.
So let's say we implemented a 1-to-1, what would be the reason behind it?
development. It's because we're trying to be consistent with the general plan and limited development in timberland. We're talking about timberland here.
Yep.
So that would
And-
keep, like, let's say we talk about a 5,000 square foot grow. Well, in actuality, what they're gonna have is probably closer to 10,000.
your operation
Although
doubles
it's only
all of
gonna
a
be
sudden.
5,000 of flowering
Right.
crop at a time, but if you didn't somehow, put a cap on your vegetative space, that could be a 30,000 square foot grow.
Sure.
Only flowering 5,000 right now.
Like if I wanted to run it really intensively and I didn't have a space limit and, I found a way to cheaply produce lots of plants, I might go double. I might produce twice as many plants as I need. And then I'm going to go and select, the half of them that are the most premium for my production because my square footage is so limited and it's so expensive. I'm going to really work it. And so I'm going to vegetate twice as much and run an intensive operation and employ twice as many people. And I'm going to throw away half of the plants, throw them away, right? And then I'm going to flower the other half of them. So you could abuse that. You could take this, you could ramp these things up. And that's why I talk about intensity of operation. You can run a 2,500 square foot operation very differently, depending on how intense you want to run it.
I understand.
And I want to see lower
Also
intensity.
could abuse your overlap too.
You could abuse, yeah.
Yeah, Jesse, I get
As far
that.
as the inspector's concerned, I'm not depot and,
Yeah.
but, I actually started 2 weeks ago, but I'm not telling anybody type of thing. So,
Yeah, you could hide it from them.
And I don't really believe at this point that's what we care about. It's the big abuse. Yeah. Questions out here, or comments, or?
What about a nursery that wants to create just stock for sale out in the market?
Right, so.
Agenda item
Not
number
in the nursery,
2.
but that'll,
This is for on-site only, so this is the vegetative space you're allowed in association with
so
your
we're going to
permit.
address that under like a new topic here.
It's only for your own use, you can't sell.
So hang on.
Joel.
Are these vegetative plants subject to the state's track and trace laws? Or is it?
No.
It comes,
They flower.
Only when they
Absolutely.
flower, that's when they tag them. So I would like to, a quick timeout here on this subject. I think we're kind of close to wrapping that up. It's kind of a procedural thing, because at some point somebody mentioned what Joel had mentioned or what you had mentioned at the Board of Supervisors, which, they take our policy or our guidelines, suggestions, whatever, over there, and then it tweaks and changes. I have not seen anything we've written up yet, and so what I'm wondering is what is the process? So we're here taking notes and throwing down ideas, and consensus is formed around a set of ideas. We're handing that to you, or you're just catching it, or what's the process? Because I guess at one point you were writing up an ordinance, and you were also on vacation. We were waiting for that to come back. I never really saw it. Did it go to the? Yeah, I just missed it. That's all.
yeah,
All
it
right.
should be in your emails for these.
Okay.
Basically, at some point, everybody kind of agrees on a list of things we all write down,
Yep.
right? All the numbers, all the setbacks.
Then should it come back here before
Yes.
it goes? That's where. All right.
Yeah.
It did.
Each
Okay.
one has.
Yes.
That's a couple meetings in a row I missed.
Yeah.
All right.
And so, but what I've been doing is I've been taking what I write down and going before the board and giving a summary and letting the board kind of object or comment.
Yeah,
And then I take that into account and bring that back here.
yeah.
And that seems to be working.
And you're happy with that process?
I am. But like I said before, these two ordinances, I think will bring the Board of Supervisors to 4 from the working group. And while the board has had input when we go before them, when Jesse and I update, none of those ordinances have been actually changed or rejected. So we get into that analysis of when does this board, this working group, turn into more than an advisory group. And it's on that consistent history of adopted recommendations. So what I want to do is get through this timberland outdoor cultivation ordinance and then reassess the role, the scope, the membership, the existence of the working group with the Board of Supervisors. So that's kind of where we are, where I am.
That's appropriate.
Yeah, okay. And where does nursery fall into that? That's,
What's next?
you want to get through that also, or you want to just get through the timber and then have that?
I'd like to get through the timber,
Yeah, okay.
and I don't want to get too far down this road where we've had too many kind of unaltered ordinances, but I don't think there's any problem talking about it or creating a list. Like if this board ceases to exist, I don't know what the board's going to do. Maybe a kind of going out recommendation of open questions to work on. Maybe it's a different working group, maybe it's just staff, maybe we just pause it, wait and see how things go and then reconstitute this group. I don't know.
Yeah,
A lot of
okay.
things could happen.
All right.
So let's
Jesse,
leave this veg thing at 1-to-1 if we can, if that sounds good.
I do
I
have
got
one
a
question
question. I
that
have a
you
question
might
on
have, sorry. Mine's a quick one.
Okay.
Is there any capability in the California law, because I've also tried to look this up, for producers, cultivators, to sell and their nursery stock to other licensed.
Only with a
cultivators.
nursery license, it costs
Only with a nursery
$5,000.
license, okay,
Yeah.
all right, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a question. If you're doing one-to-one with your flower and your vegetation, what about your producing area when it's done with the flower and you've got to trim and you've got to do all that? Is that another one?
That's another building.
Oh, it's not part of your
it's not a
canopy,
license.
though. No, it's
But
not
it's
your
not as
canopy
far as your
area.
canopy.
It's not counted
20
space.
Grow canopy.
No, your processing shed has to be part of your plan, you know.
So,
But
I think in the spirit, this is, I'd like us maybe to just wrap up and agree on this concept of one-to-one. In the spirit of, what we're ultimately trying to do, and that's somewhat limit, Del Norte County from being a major player, is, I'd like the one-to-one, as long as we can live through it, the scenario that Kurt explained. And it sounds like, well, that's going to happen 5% or 10% of the time, where you could theoretically be out of compliance, but you could also justify that you're in compliance. As long as we're okay with that kind of grayness in that situation, then the intent of our rule is intact.
I mean, you could exempt a 100 square foot propagation area if you wanted to, so you could keep, some propagation activities going with plants and not go over your one-to-one ratio. But that's splitting hairs that I think is not.
And the concept, Jesse, that you brought up of doubling your vegetative space, right? That, you're not going to do that very often at that expense, right?
Well, you would
So
if
you
were-
might, but it's also self-limiting.
Yeah, I mean, you would, depending on, it's sort of just the spirit of what I want to see here, where I live. I don't want to see, lots of big industrial aggressive operations going on in places where I want, a family home life homestead scene going on. That's kind of like the mountains in Humboldt are like industrial agriculture operations. They're hot neighborhoods and they're terrible to live in, because they're huge, and so it's, I'm not saying we're going to go there, but it's just one more way, one more little tool to keep it mellow, keep it the way we want it, that sort of thing.
Is there anybody that has problems with one-to-one?
No. Not necessarily, no, but, there could be, I can foresee issues, and the reason why they did not limit the nursery, from what I understand, your capability to produce nursery stock is, just like any other agricultural product, you have crop loss.
Yeah.
You could have things that could literally, I could foresee, and I'm not saying that this is a potential, from a business standpoint, any farmer is not going to produce more than what he's going to use, because it's a waste of money. It's inefficient.
Right.
But I do think that, it may just need a little bit more studying. Maybe we just take the one-to-one at this point, roll with it, and see if when they are up and running, see if that's a capability. If you get a 20% crop loss on your root stock, again, you might be, not capable of filling out your canopy space because your plant stock ratio isn't.
It could be.
there.
I use 50% right now. I use half of my production space for vegetative.
1.5 to 1 type of a deal if we got to that point, maybe.
The thing is, though,
I don't think you need to,
2,500 square
though.
foot, if we're one-to-one and we're saying square footage, your nursery plant stocks are usually in 4-gallon to 1-gallon pots.
That's a lot. I use half
Well,
of
that's what I'm
my.
saying, if you have a 20% loss, you're still going to have more than enough plants if you actually fill the one-to-one space to fill up a new flowering space.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
it just
But we're
depends on
just-
how you're doing that vegetative space. If you're actually growing full-on plants before you start doing it.
I account for
filling it that way, it's just
25%
different.
loss, and I use half of my production space for my vegetative space. So I only need
Yeah, okay.
half to one,
I
you
think-
know.
So Eric, you're good with one-to-one?
I'm fine with it.
Okay.
So what I'm doing is I'm doubling what I use and saying that's enough.
So we have no similar restriction in the ordinance for the indoor. Do you think that this should one-to-one be generally applicable? Is it not an issue? Is
I
this
think
specifically for
it could
timberland?
be, but it's so expensive to overproduce inside that
And-
it's probably pretty rare. But
In indoor, you're going to definitely have a less possibility of filling up that, let's say, a 1-to-1 space or a 2-to-1 space, because it's all mostly, almost entirely containerized, and you're going from a small plant and putting it into a flowering chamber area. And like you said, the cost is extreme with the lighting and whatnot involved. So
it's
you're
in-
not having that, I'm growing a full big plant before I start light depoting
already
it type of thing
self-limited.
that would
think
encompass all of that
so.
square footage.
So Do you catch that? They're saying it's self-limiting or it inherently doesn't need to be regulated.
You could just say one-to-one also, though, and that would be more than enough space, if that's the question. You're
you
not
wanna
going to
keep it.
limit, I don't think you're going to really limit anybody by,
Is it easier for you to go one-to-one
Indoor
there?
operation would in theory never exceed 1:1.
It's the same difference to me, it's just where I put the one-to-one. Do I put it in the section that's
Yeah.
regulations for all cannabis growing, or do I put it in the section that's specific for outdoor? It doesn't make a difference to me.
Put it in all, it sounds
it
like.
just can't apply to nurseries. So that's cannabis. Yeah.
That would be the exemption.
Okay.
Yeah, just for cultivation style.
Right, nurseries aren't licensed by size, there's just,
Well, they also don't come in the definition of cultivation area, do they?
Yeah.
well,
Because the cultivation area definition in the state has is mature
it's
flowering
called,
plant.
no, it's called cultivation, and then you can have an experimental flowering zone that's also not limited by size, where none of the product can enter the legal market, which is important. You have to be able to test and flower strains, but there's no size limit there, so that's why the nursery license is quite expensive. There's just one, it's $5,000, and there isn't a limit on that. But it's all called cultivation, the whole operation. It's not the complete process that's considered cultivation, but any one component of tending a plant, I believe. And then actually, interestingly, processing, if you have a processing license, it's called cultivation, but then processors are not allowed to cultivate. That language kind of contradicts itself. But it's broadly used, the term, I think.
Okay.
All right.
On-site.
Question out here, or comment?
Just on the,
You've been getting away with that all day.
The state recognizes that veg space doesn't count if a nursery, going back to the nursery thing, if a nursery is just providing clones, going out to clubs, and you're never doing any production there,
Right.
I don't see how this is going to apply, or.
But we haven't got
is your
that far yet.
terminology
We aren't on
do that
nursery
over
yet.
We
here?
aren't on nursery.
Yeah, no, it won't apply, I don't
Okay.
think.
This is a different scenario
Yeah.
because this is having to do with the flowering of the commercial whatnot.
So on-site sewage disposal, just kind of the last things, trying to wrap up the timberland thing. We talked about requiring living on the property, I don't know, or requiring a caretaker. I don't know if you can really define that. We did talk about requiring on-site sewage disposal systems permitted. You have that language in the indoor ordinance. Perhaps it should be the same in the outdoor, and that would cover the intention to have somebody living there, have a county-approved sewage disposal system.
So would a county-approved sewage disposal system, could that be considered a portable toilet system that's basically serviced by week?
I think, yeah, like a serviced porta potty counts.
Yeah, because I think that's going to be something that, I mean, do we want all of our, say, small sewage disposal
knows.
systems, waste disposal systems that are hooked up to a residence, some of them are going to be, small in comparison to what the usage would be. So I don't know how, I mean, if that's where we're going, I would be in agreement with that. I don't necessarily know how we make it so that, every farm has its own separate septic system separated from a residence.
My two cents on that is I don't like requiring on-site people living there. The first thing I think of are some of these environmental disasters we're having in the timberlands in Humboldt County where people dump their garbage in the back 40, dumping sewage, it's, you're talking about, okay, so how are you going to find someone to live in a trailer that's portable, right?
Well, it's not that so much, it's like the 10 people
TPZ
that
land,
live
we're going
in
to
there.
require now you put in septic tanks and build houses on all these pieces of properties, like
Where does this?
I don't like at all the required to live on these, what are currently unimproved pieces of property.
Well, I was suggesting dropping the required to live, because that's hard to define, and then just putting a sewage disposal requirement on there, because that also covers your workers, your employees. If you're gonna have people working all day, you can't be shitting in the woods.
No, you can't. It's against the law.
So like you said, it's a porta potty, okay?
That's
Rotor,
the-
rotor.
That's something we have
porta-potty.
to check out. I'll have to check with environmental health
Right.
and building inspection to find out what
Okay,
can be.
porta potties,
permitted.
question mark.
Is that only during particular times of the year or year-round?
Yeah, like your intensity is gonna go up at particular times of year where you're gonna have more people, so I could see it being appropriate to, during these busy times, to be allowed to use porta potties on a temporary basis. Just like temporary labor camps are allowed in timberland.
Yeah, they are.
So,
Labor rules are okay
so
with
to
porta
build a
potties.
temporary labor camp.
But I
you'd have
think to
have
your
porta
answer,
potties.
Heidi, I think at any time somebody's there should be adequate areas to go potty instead of just
Then
having
the
it
question
at a
becomes
certain
whether or
time.
not,
That's labor rules, and there's certainly that porta potties with wash stations, those are requirements, and those are applicable, and they cover all the employee situations where you
I
have
don't
employees
think-
on site.
I don't think we even need to waste time talking about any of this.
I mean, I think, yeah, the state covers
We're talking,
most of that.
if we're talking about on-site people living there, then that's something we need to talk about, but as far as labor goes, that's between you and the labor
And-
situation, and you have to
Just to be
provide
clear,
that.
we've already decided we're not going to require on-site people to live there. That's also not, that's way
Right.
out of our zone.
Right.
Totally.
Okay?
We need a
So-
sewage thing, we just have to
We-
decide what's allowed, what's
Are we ready to
not.
move on to nursery?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Give me some basic parameters about what a nursery is. I understand it's, it's basically propagating plants from, I don't know, seed or clones up to.
Cuttings, they're not clones.
Through vegetative.
I hate that word. Nobody's cloned cannabis, ever.
Yeah, you weren't in the Ferndale in the 80s.
You were cloning in the 80s?
Absolutely they were, yeah.
You don't know what cloning means.
Well, it was the term used. It was
Yes,
different.
you're propagating,
Yeah.
you're propagating by
Yeah.
cutting.
Yeah, this is before the term cloning was developed.
Cloning is like Dolly the sheep.
So, I get that, I know
Okay.
that, yeah.
Sorry, it's just a thing that I can't
A
stand.
pet peeve,
Not
we just
clones.
found his button, didn't we?
If you want to bother me, say clone.
Before we go, is this an indoor or an outdoor primarily activity?
Either or, right?
It's
what's-
mostly an indoor, it would be in a greenhouse style situation for nursery stock.
The most economic version of it would be in a greenhouse version using a lot of natural light.
Yeah, totally.
Is it, and it's defined as like vegetative only, is that?
Yeah.
Vegetative only with an unlimited sizing area, to flower out your specific strain stock that you have.
Testing.
None of that can make it to market. It's supposed to be destroyed and
testing
quarantined
purposes.
after a
Like your
certain
parent
time.
stock?
Oh, so
Exactly. It's
testing,
kind of like, yeah, it's
not
like if you had a
parent
cow
stock.
and you bred two cows together, but then
Yeah.
you wanted to breed another cow with that.
No, it'd be
cow,
like,
so you can,
it'd be like squeezing milk
Yeah.
to taste it
Yeah.
without selling it.
Gotcha.
That's the.
Okay, so those are unregulated things on the state's end, but definitely as a county, those are things
And
that
all
we can
nurseries
control.
would do that, or?
Not
yeah,
necessarily.
not all
but most.
necessary,
No.
not all nurseries, only nurseries that are into breeding.
Breeding,
That
right,
are
that's
trying
right.
to create their own proprietary strain.
So what are we proposing in this county? Do we want those kind of breeding nurseries? Do we want?
Yes.
Truthfully, I would love to see that kind of
That would be
style. I mean,
wise.
one of my questions would be how, and if it were possible to, to combine a nursery separated with a cultivation on one
Mm-hmm.
parcel. That would be something I would like to throw out there.
Yeah, and that seems fine. I would just say that the flowering testing portion of your nursery site would need to follow much the same rules as cultivation, especially if it's in ag land. So your ag land, flowering portion would need to be, there'd be more tight controls in order to mitigate nuisance than if you were just doing a nursery operation, but
So,
I don't know how you would, if there's a need to
kind of
define
the
that
obvious,
separately.
the obvious question, because I don't know any of this stuff, is that, so if you're allowing a flowering segment of a nursery, then obviously then you've got material that could be sold.
No,
How
Can't be
does that,
sold.
how does that prevent?
Not under that license.
you can't
So,
sell period
under
at
that
all,
license,
ever.
you couldn't
You can't
sell
sell it
a
under
flower,
any
no.
license. You can't sell it under any license. The flowers, legally, well,
Yeah.
of course, everything.
And what you're producing
We're
is
talking about what's
seeded,
legal.
So it wouldn't
It has to be
value
destroyed.
as a drug,
The flower has to be destroyed. It can't be sold or, I can't find how you're allowed to test it, by consuming it. I didn't see that provision yet, but you're not allowed to sell it under any license, under any circumstance.
So one easy way to go about that would be that you would put a size limitation on the square footage that you're allowed to have as a flowering test facility under your nursery, and then you could be adhering it to any of the zonings that you're in. Like, you would have to adhere to the zones we've already created for commercial, like all of the requirements, whether it be visual or your setback or your smell mitigation, however you were doing it, would need to conform
I
with
will
our
say,
commercials.
the consulting job that I have right now, currently in Oregon, we do have a test breeding farm in Grants Pass. the flowering space for the test breeds are basically pretty small. You know, we're not putting a lot of effort into them. We're taking the best breeding stock that we find. We throw those into a flowering room, see what happens. We're not really in it to produce large plants. So all of this stock that we're talking about is literally you're taking a very small plant and you're growing it pretty quickly after it roots, because you want to see the flower that comes out.
I think
You
there's a
wanna see
need
the
to limit
potential
it,
of that.
unless you're trying to prevent illegal diversion.
Yeah.
Which is a different conversation and purpose altogether. But
Yeah, and
from
we're
a
not-
just business standpoint, there's no reason to limit the test area. Because
Yeah.
what if that's your business? Your whole business is about testing seeds. You don't do anything except you sprout thousands and thousands of seeds looking for
And literally,
winners.
you know, we just recently, we sprouted 2,500 seeds. Out of those 2,500 seeds, the breeder may only choose 15 of those plants to move forward into a flowering test run. That's literally just the name of the game with breeding. You know, a breeder will go in there, he'll look at 2,500. The more plants a breeder can look at for the specific phenotypical growth things that they're looking for, the better and more obvious the success rate is going to be for what they're trying to achieve. But they're not looking at it like, okay, we're going to take, you know, we're going to sprout 5,000 seeds and then we're going to grow 4,900 of them to flower. That's not what a breeder's about. Nursery and breeding stock, you're literally looking for specific growth characteristics that are attributed to what you're trying to find for that. And again, it could be, you know, you could literally pick 5 out of 2,500. You never know. And the next time it may be 400 of those.
Yeah, there's hundreds of
plants
different
show and
ways to
exhibit.
run a nursery business model, and I don't think that we need to, it's one area of business we don't need to over-regulate, leave it alone, leave nurseries to run their operation, how they want to run it and what they want to do. We can't guess at it, and
So-
we can talk about the nuisance mitigation. And I
What are
think that's it.
what are the potential parameters then that we would consider for nurseries?
So you're just looking, you know, like
Size.
size and zone?
Yeah, I don't think size even enters into it. Like, I'm thinking of this more like the hemp program. It's very similar to that, and so this is the place where we could actually produce jobs without upsetting anybody. This
And
is
they're
really where
year-round
it's at.
jobs. They're consistent,
Year-round jobs.
constant.
So I think the parameters should be, the things that we came up with as nuisance issues during the ag land discussion. You can't create a nuisance, period,
Why?
that's it.
I mean, why is this different? Why is this less likely to upset people? I don't know anything about it. Why is it?
There's a lot less smell involved in it. Your vegetative flowering plants don't have as much of that smell. You're literally growing them much smaller than you would see on a flowering farm, you know, because your breeding stock is much smaller.
What size are they when they leave the nursery?
They're usually in a gallon pot to 4-inch.
They have a new rule now, the new regs,
Yep.
they defined that's 18 inches in any direction is now a mature plant.
In Oregon, they consider anything over 24 inches tall considered to be a mature plant, regardless if it's in flower or not.
So they can't sell it
Exactly.
as a clone?
Exactly. They have to keep it under 24. Now, there's ways around that. You continue to top that thing down until it's 20 inches, and
He's
you know,
picking
you just
fights now.
keep it at 20 inches tall.
Yeah, you'd have to prune, you can prune
You
the
keep-
plants to be
yeah.
in compliance, so the age isn't important. But yeah, small numbers of plants, it's mostly the smell. Other than that, really isn't anything
Okay.
different, you know, but.
And just,
Well, a lot of times you'll have a more normal business hour operation as well.
Exactly.
Than
Yeah,
some of the
right.
businesses we've talked about, like, for example, the indoor operation.
And the black market value, you're not producing something with the black market value as you are with finished.
Yeah.
It's like more like grapes in the vineyard than it is bottles of wine hanging in the vineyard.
yeah.
So to answer your question, basically, it's not producing a product that can be possibly used by children. It's just not.
It's safer, it's not it can't harm anyone.
Supplying people who are going to then grow the usable product.
It's just a plant, man.
Most of it.
Yeah.
Is your mic on? I don't think your mic's on.
You got control of the
How do we make sure that people aren't jumping, high school kids aren't jumping fences, taking flowers, getting a hold of it, getting into the wrong people's hands?
Joel's got a hold of it.
Nobody could hear me. Anyway, so that might help you out with that question. It's literally not producing usable product. And then the flower that they are doing in order to do their breeding programs is generally going to be very small, not a whole lot of amountage, can't go into the regulated market at all, has to be destroyed, and then anything that they would do on scale is going to be strictly for seed and destroyed with the seed extraction. And then they don't, once a cannabis flower seeds out, it pretty much stops making size, so.
That's all true.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've got 10 minutes to wrap up.
One thing I would like to say, and you know, mention within the nursery thing, if you're a nursery who is basically breeding males and you are pollinating flowering plants, we could have an issue if we had any unregulated or unmitigated outdoor breeding programs that could affect neighboring parcels that may be cultivating flower. And so I don't know how we define that within the discussion.
Yeah, nurseries should be away from permitted cultivation sites.
Or at least separated.
Unless they're your own.
Unless they're your own, or unless they're in an indoor area, mitigated with odor control and charcoal filtering systems to knock out the pollen. Because I do know that this has happened in Grants Pass. Again,
this affects hemp
another
too.
Oregon example. You know, there was a large-scale outdoor farm that was producing flowering plants in their outdoor space, and there was a local nursery breeder who was breeding in a parcel next door, and he was about 2,500 foot away, and he literally seeded half of the crop from his adjoining neighbor. They worked it out together in conjunction. Obviously, there was no war, but it was definitely an issue, and it's just something that, you know, I think within our space we should probably consider in discussion how we prevent that type of thing from happening.
Yeah, some space.
What are the possibilities of how we could?
Well, truthfully, I mean, I think anybody who's going to be doing nursery breeding stock is going to be doing it indoors. They're not going to do it outdoors in the open. That's just not possible. You've got to keep them. Then you're only breeding plants from, you know, May to July, and then you're not anymore.
You can't be certain of your breeding either. If you're outside, you can't be certain you're not getting pollen from somewhere else. And that's why the hemp thing requires such massive setbacks when you're producing certified seed.
So nurseries would be required to be indoors?
Well, I don't, again, I'm not saying that they're required.
Breeding nurseries.
Yeah, breeding nurseries.
Where you're producing pollen. Okay, so there's nurseries where you're never dealing with male plants ever.
You're just buying seed
and you're spreading
plants.
Cuttings. Produced by various forms of propagation.
He's confused.
Yes, we're cloning sheep. Next, we're going to be cloning people.
But I do think that, yeah, I mean, you know, maybe that is how we get to it. If you're going to be doing your own breeding stock,
that's
you know, maybe there should be a requirement to be indoors, or at least separated or segregated.
Timberland nurseries need scale limitations.
Yeah.
If we're gonna, I think they should be allowed in timberland, but that's where the scale of a nursery needs to be considered, just so we can be consistent with this, you know, limited development in timberland. Because you could get out of control with a nursery in timberland.
In timberland, is it indoors still?
No, well, we're saying breeding part of nursery. So if you're not breeding, then there's no need to be indoors.
Can we, as a cannabis committee of Del Norte County, recommend to our supervisors that as far as going with the nursery program, it's indoors?
We could, is that, I mean, is that shooting ourselves in the foot?
No, that's terrible, because only a small, tiny part of the nursery is inside.
Yeah, we're talking about the pollination, the controlling of that situation.
Yeah.
Can you clarify the difference between breeding and the flowering piece, or is that the same?
Yes, breeding is when you're using, so it's dioecious crops, male and female, and then you're producing seeds.
So you're bringing those plants to
flowering
in a similar scenario.
Only female plants. Again, dioecious plants, but only female, generally not hermaphroditic plants. They're just for flowering, or just female and they flower, they don't produce pollen and therefore don't produce seeds. That would be the difference. So a breeding nursery would be having males and pollen.
Something that collects pollen. It could almost simplify it to that.
Those flowers would then be producing seeds inside of them, and you'd be harvesting the seeds out of them.
What'd you say?
Yeah, it's plants that produce
pollen.
It would be the breeding nursery.
I mean, I don't know how many breeders.
Versus the nurseries that would just take cuttings and be producing
Thank you,
cuttings. I was going to say it, but I figured I'd be nice.
Yeah, or buying seed stock as a
And some
nursery.
nurseries would never do any of the breeding at all, ever possibly. That would be
Sure,
just their business
absolutely.
model could be working with certain local
Seeds,
people or out of the
yeah.
area people and be producing
So-
plants,
So
small
what-
plants that would be sent to those places.
What do all of you want for our county?
So indoors totally out, it's got to be a variety of in or out.
Correct. Indoor or outdoor, depending on what you're doing. Most of your propagation is done inside. Your breeding, I think, should be required to be done inside, because especially if we're going to have hemp in the county, we got to keep them separate. And then in the timberland, there may be more flexibility for having breeding outside, although again, you're going to run into the same kind of situations with neighboring properties, so probably should just require breeding to be done inside as a blanket. So it's simpler, yeah. And then timberland, the only difference would be the scale of your operation needs to be limited by square footage. I would suggest the same kind of square footage limitations that we have for cultivation. Times 2, because for a 2,500 square foot permit allows you 5,000 square foot of growing space. So that's where we should cap nurseries in timberland also. You know, if we're going to have larger than that in certain timberlands with paved road access, then correspond that to nurseries. But nurseries they're going to have the same kind of impact to development in the land and water and employee traffic, probably maybe even more employee traffic with nurseries per square foot.
Right. But they'll have a lot less impact nuisance-wise from the smell and the visual aspect.
And
of
the
it.
security
plants
issue is
aren't
not the same for a nursery. Like a timberland nursery is, to me, that's beautiful. It's clean. There isn't pollen around, clean in terms of pests and diseases. It's out of sight. It doesn't invite security and crime concerns.
There is a commercial nursery at the top of the corner of Birch and Roy that is right now, that is in an R1A zone. And if the only reason why I agreed to not fight you guys on the rural residential stuff was because Jesse made a very valid point about the security risk. And absolutely, you do not have the right to expose your neighbors to that security risk, somebody going to the wrong house, whatever it may be. I conceded on that one. But you just admitted that there wasn't one, so talk about that.
You'll have to go out to lunch some more so I can protect the county from you.
That should fix it all.
No, yeah, at some point, I suppose, maybe we could figure out a way, once we know more about nurseries and how they operate, they could start to fit into places where production's not appropriate. So I get what you're saying, but I don't think this reiteration of the ordinance is going to, it's not going to include that.
I don't think the supervisors are going to go.
Yeah, that's what I mean. This round, we can't include anything with residential,
Okay.
but duly noted. Yeah, no, do
All right.
please, thank you.
You are now on record. We've got 2 minutes left. Any final departing thoughts here for building our agenda, and then, of course, next meeting?
Yes.
When do you want to meet? I can call Kylie.
So the board's meeting November 13th and then again December 11th. That's correct, right?
That is correct.
All right, 2 meetings left before the
I'm
end of the
already
year.
taking a little, like, the 2 week thing is all right with me right now.
I'm okay with
Perfect.
that, too.
I'm not feeling like, unless you would like to do a meeting next week, Paul.
So you're saying the
Heidi,
19th, do you want a Monday, or do you want to go back to Wednesday?
You can't go on Wednesday on the 21st.
Mondays are fine with me. Blake, that better for you?
Yeah,
So-
generally. Okay.
Mondays, I just may always be a little late, 5 to 10 minutes. I have to drop
Okay.
my son off at school
All right.
on
Okay.
Mondays, so.
So Monday, what
Monday,
now?
the 19th.
Okay.
Day before my birthday. Everybody bring me a present, please.
3 days after mine.
19th.
Really? Hey, all right, Scorpio.
Oh, no wonder. He's Scorpio.
Explains
Okay,
a
I
lot,
get it.
huh?
Right.
It does.
Okay, and then after that, 2 weeks after that would be the December 3rd. We want to generally plan on that.
I'm okay with that.
Oh, we want another day?
Tentatively go out to December 3rd.
Okay, so we are good for the 19th.
Okay, good.
Really excited.
I've got to be in San Diego the day after, and I don't, odds are maybe I'll be here,
On
So-
which day?
the 3rd December.
Oh, all right.
So are we on for the,
You want to wait to schedule that then? That's a month out.
Okay, we'll wait.
All right.
you guys don't want the 3rd?
Yeah, we're going to skip that and we'll schedule, maybe we'll wait.
Thanks.
Okay, well, then
I mean,
I'll
is that
call her
whatever?
again.
Cool with you?
Okay, thanks, Heidi.
So I don't want to speak for everyone here.
In terms of the agenda, we're going to be starting with nursery, and then we'll have industrial hemp to follow that. So you can let her know. She'll be sending emails.
Okay.
Report from the tax.
Oh, that's
Big day tomorrow, everybody out in the public, go out and vote, no matter how you vote,
That's
just
right.
vote.
Do vote. So we're
you
done
don't
with
know how to vote, ask me.
Timberland? Leave Timberland off? You done with that for now, or do you want to, is there anything you want to wrap up?
Check that box.
Well, Joel, do you have enough to do something on Timberland?
Blake didn't want to talk about pooping in the woods, kind
I
of
know,
rushed
I
off
kinda-
of that.
Yeah, so unless when Heidi and I get together and talk, there are things that staff, cares what you guys think about.
Oh, stuff.
If there's things that staff just want and they don't care what you think about, then we'll just put them in. But if there's things that staff cares about your opinions,
Okay.
then
You'll bring it to us.
we'll bring it.
Okay, so for
Very
the
good.
next agenda,
And-
we'll just do nurseries and the hemp program, or do you want to add anything else? Is that enough?
No, that's enough. And the toiletry deal, if you've got employees, you're already regulated. It's just not our job.
Okay.
That-
And then,
Where that's coming from.
right, I get what you're saying. Okay, and
agree
then
with that.
the building questions, do we want to, I don't know, maybe just between now and then, we'll get some questions to you for the building people
for
in
the
the
building
next
department.
meeting?
Yes, I will
Okay.
see whether or not he's available on.
Do we want that on
that
the
date.
agenda? Does that need to be on the agenda?
Yeah.
I want to take care of this agenda thing today.
Chances
if
are
I
he
can.
will be available, but again, we would like the questions. And if he's not available, if you do have the questions, I can still get the responses and I can muddle through it.
Sure. So
Yeah, they're
is
pretty
that-
simple
Is that the
questions.
agenda somehow, Joel?
Yeah, I mean, if he's going to be here to speak and address the board.
Okay,
then
what
it's
should
the
I,
agenda.
how do I write that?
I don't know.
I don't like having to think about this every
I feel
time.
like a
Good.
Q&A with county building official.
Yeah,
There you
Okay,
go.
perfect.
tell a friend.
And you might have a Q&A on the taxes.
Maybe we should sell tickets.
Because you'll have a board meeting.
Okay,
I don't think we
I
have to agendize that.
think we're
but-
wrapped up, 12:02. Thanks, everyone, for coming.